It begins not with a crown or a conquest, but with the quiet restlessness of an island. A stretch of green and gray land buffeted by salt winds, battered by centuries of war, and shaped by survival. For most of its early history, Britain was not an empire. It was a fractured land of tribal kings, Viking raids, Norman invaders, dynastic squabbles that echoed across moors, forests, and muddy fields. But beneath the feudal grime something stirred, a hunger not just to endure, but to expand. The idea of empire did not come all at once. It crept in slowly, almost silently, growing out of necessity, out of rivalry, and out of the deep. Ancient anxiety of being small in a world filled with larger powers, France, Spain, the Ottoman Empire. These were the giants of the age. Their banners already planted across oceans, their ships already carving out the modern world. Britain, isolated by sea, but obsessed with influence, looked outward and saw not just threats but possibilities. If it could not dominate Europe by force, perhaps it could reach beyond it. Through trade, exploration, something else entirely, controlled by commerce. It began in the margins. Pirateers and smugglers, sanctioned and unsanctioned, raided Spanish ships and returned with gold. Merchant vessels sailed out not to claim land but to exchange, tin for spices, wool for silks, knowledge for opportunity. These early voyages were not yet imperial, but they planted the roots of what would become a pattern, a strategy of soft entry followed by firm grip. England's first colonial ventures were awkward and often disastrous. Attempts to settle Newfoundland, Roanoke, and the Caribbean were plagued by disease, mutiny, and logistical chaos. But the ambition was there, and it was growing. As the Tudor dynasty gave way to the Stuarts, and later the chaos of civil war, England looked increasingly outward as a form of identity and cohesion. Trade routes to India, Africa, and the Americas became arteries not just of goods, but of thought. The sea became the empire's nervous system. Ships were its messengers, weapons, and explorers all at once. And in this period of experimentation and instability, the idea of an island nation growing into a maritime power took hold, not through legislation or doctrine, but through momentum. Then came the formation of the East India Company. Not a government, not a military, but something more insidious. A corporation with cannons. Chartered in 1600, it was a private enterprise that operated with public blessing, empowered to wage war, sign treaties, and govern people, all in the name of profit. It was through this strange hybrid of commerce and conquest that Britain would first begin to extend its reach into Asia, not by invading, but by embedding itself into the markets, politics, and internal rivalries of the Mughal Empire. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, colonies were forming with greater permanence. Jamestown in 1607, Plymouth in 1620. These settlements, precarious as they were, marked the beginning of Britain's hold on North America. What had once been pirate coves and resupply stations became towns, plantations, and centers of administration. The colonies were not just remote outposts. They became reflections of British society, importing its class systems, its institutions, and eventually, its conflicts. Religion also played a vital role in these early expansions. Protestant England, surrounded by Catholic rivals, saw its colonial ventures as both economic and spiritual. The New World was not only a source of sugar and tobacco, it was also a mission field, a place to spread a purified version of Christianity, untouched by papal influence. Settlers often believed they were civilizing as well as colonizing. Their sense of righteousness entwined with their hunger for land. By the late 1600s, the stage was set. Britain was not yet the empire it would become, but it was no longer merely a participant in European affairs. It had tasted the power of global reach. Its navy, still growing, had begun to see itself not just as a defense mechanism, but as an instrument of projection. Its trading companies, increasingly militarized, operated as unofficial governments. Its monarchs began to think in terms of dominion, not just rule. And its people, many of them poor and landless, saw opportunity not at home but abroad. In Jamaica, in India, in Virginia, in places they could barely pronounce. This chapter of British history is not yet defined by domination, but by transformation. An island once invaded from all directions had begun to launch its own incursions. The sea, once a barrier, became a bridge. Trade became conquest. Conquest became governance. And the British Empire, still unnamed, began to dream of something far larger than itself, a dream that would stretch across centuries, across continents and into the lives of millions who had never seen the Union Jack, but would one day bow before it. If the British Empire was built on trade, it was powered by sugar. White, crystalline, sweet to the tongue but soaked in blood, suffering, and unrelenting cruelty. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the Caribbean was not a paradise. It was an inferno designed for profit. And as the empire expanded across the globe, it was these sun-scorched islands, Barbados, Jamaica, Antigua, that became the core of its wealth, its brutality, and its contradictions. At first glance, the sugar colonies appeared modest, small clusters of land surrounded by warm seas, dotted with cane fields and overseen by white planters who called themselves gentlemen. But these plantations were not farms, they were factories, and the men who ran them were not stewards of land, but overseers of vast systems of forced labor to fuel this system. Britain turned to a trade that would stain its history more deeply than any other: the Atlantic slave trade. Ships left British ports laden with goods, textiles, guns, metal tools, and crossed the sea to West Africa, where local rulers, middlemen, and raiding parties delivered enslaved people in exchange. These human beings were shackled, branded, and packed into ships so tightly that the voyage across the Atlantic, known as the Middle Passage, became a floating graveyard. Disease spread rapidly. Death was constant. Those who survived the journey arrived in the Caribbean not as workers but as property, bought and sold at auction blocks like livestock. Their names erased, their pasts severed, their futures dictated by plantation schedules and overseers' whips. The British Empire, for all its talk of civilization and law, constructed much of its early wealth on this unspoken foundation, a machine of human extraction that turned bodies into labor, labor into sugar, and sugar into vast profit. The plantations were brutal by design. Enslaved people worked from dawn until nightfall under a tropical sun, often with no shoes, little food, and no legal protection. They were whipped for disobedience, mutilated for escape, and killed for resistance. Women were violated, children were beaten, and entire generations were born into servitude with no knowledge of freedom, only endurance. Back in London, Liverpool, and Bristol, few questioned where the wealth came from. Sugar flowed into teacups. Molasses sweetened the rum. The profits bankrolled universities, built mansions, funded parliamentary seats, and expanded naval power. Investors grew rich not by tilling the soil themselves, but by buying shares in companies that managed the business of slavery from afar. It was violence outsourced, made invisible, and justified through racist pseudoscience and theology that claimed some people were born to serve. But the system was never without resistance. On the plantations, enslaved people rebelled, sometimes subtly, sometimes violently. They broke tools, feigned illness, sang songs of resistance, and passed down memories of freedom in stories, names, and prayers. Uprisings occurred across the islands, some lasting hours, others weeks. The empire responded with force, executions, torture, and fear. But the idea of resistance could never be fully extinguished. It lived in the whispers, the escapes, and the communities that formed in the hills and forests away from the overseers' eyes. In Britain, too, the reality of slavery began to stir unease. Religious groups, especially Quakers, raised voices in protest. Former slaves who had managed to escape or be freed began to publish narratives, their words, cutting through the polite illusions of empire and revealing a truth that could no longer be ignored. Still, for more than 2 centuries, the trade persisted, defended by economists, justified by planters, and ignored by much of the population, who preferred the sweetness of their tea to the bitterness of its cost. What the Caribbean offered the British Empire was not just wealth, but proof that domination could be systematized. It showed that a distant island could be turned into a furnace of production, fueled by cruelty, protected by law, and justified by power. The lessons learned in Jamaica and Barbados: how to control populations, manage supply chains, suppress dissent, and maximize profit, would be exported elsewhere, to India, to Africa, to Southeast Asia. The Sugar Islands were the test ground, the prototype, the heart of a darker imperial logic. And though their names may be small on modern maps, their role in the rise of Britain's global power was enormous. Without the Caribbean, the British Empire might have remained a maritime dream. With it, it became a machine, vast, brutal, and insatiable. And that machine was only just beginning to spread. Empires are often remembered for their armies, their monarchs, their monuments, for the maps they redraw and the wars they wage. But in the case of Britain, one of the most powerful engines of expansion was not a government or a general, but a private company with a royal charter and a ruthless eye for profit. The East India Company, born at the turn of the 17th century, began as a trading venture, but by the 1800s, it would control vast regions of the Indian subcontinent, command its own armies, mint its own currency, and rule over tens of millions of people with astonishing authority. At first, the company's ambitions were modest. Chartered in 1600 under Queen Elizabeth I, the East India Company was created to break into the lucrative spice trade of the East Indies, a domain already dominated by the Portuguese and Dutch. British merchants wanted cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon, the fragrant currencies of global commerce. But they also wanted access to cotton, silk, tea, and opium, commodities that promised both wealth and leverage. These traders were not explorers. They were financiers, agents, and naval tacticians, backed by private capital and political connections. Denied dominance in the East Indies, the company shifted its focus to India, where it established coastal trading posts in Surat, Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta. These outposts began as business stations, fortified warehouses designed to protect goods, not people. And soon, the company began to entangle itself in local politics. It offered protection to rival princes. It manipulated succession crises. It inserted itself into disputes under the guise of diplomacy. Trade became influence, influence became interference, and before long, the company was not merely operating in India, it was reshaping it. The turning point came in 1757 at the Battle of Plassey. Through a calculated combination of bribery, military maneuvering, and sheer opportunism, a small force led by company officer Robert Clive defeated a vastly larger Bengali army. The victory gave the East India Company control over Bengal, one of the wealthiest regions in the world at the time, and with it came tax revenues, legal authority, and political power. It was a battle that marked a transformation. The company had ceased to be a commercial operation, it had become a colonial force. What followed was nearly a century of corporate governance on a scale never seen before or since. The East India Company raised its own private armies, hundreds of thousands of sepoys, or native Indian soldiers, led by British officers. It issued its own laws, built its own courts, and developed a parallel bureaucracy that mimicked the functions of a sovereign state. It was empire outsourced, the violence of conquest disguised as a ledger entry, the repression of dissent justified as a contractual necessity. Under company rule, Indian agriculture was transformed not to feed its people, but to fill British warehouses. Cotton replaced food crops. Indigo plantations poisoned the land. Opium production soared, not for domestic use, but for export to China, where the drug would be used as a weapon of economic domination. Famines swept through India in the 18th and 19th centuries, not because of natural causes alone, but because of the company's indifference to suffering. Profits mattered, lives did not. And yet, like all empires, this one met resistance. Indian peasants revolted, soldiers mutinied, intellectuals began to write in defiance. The most explosive uprising came in 1857. When Indian soldiers within the company's own army rose in rebellion, fueled by religious outrage, brutal treatment, and decades of accumulated resentment, it was a brutal and bloody conflict, one that ultimately failed, but shook the foundations of British rule. In its aftermath, the British Crown stepped in. The East India Company, now viewed as unstable and corrupt even by its own backers, was dissolved. India became an official colony of the British Empire, governed not by merchants, but by monarchs and viceroys. But the legacy of the company lived on, in the systems it created, the infrastructures it built, and the deep scars it left behind. It had ruled not as a nation, but as a corporation, and in doing so, it had shown the world a new model of imperialism, one that wielded contracts like weapons and profits like flags. To many in Britain, the company had brought civilization, law, and order. To many in India, it had brought exploitation, humiliation, and loss. It taught the British how to rule at a distance, how to extract without investing, how to dominate without occupying every inch of land. It also revealed a truth often forgotten in the telling of empire, that conquest does not always arrive with banners and swords. Sometimes it comes quietly in ledgers and contracts, carried not by soldiers but by clerks and accountants. The East India Company began as a dream of trade. It ended as an empire, and the world it reshaped would never be the same. No empire expands without consequence, and no conquest is permanent, not even when enforced by muskets, fleets, and red-coated soldiers marching in rows across the land. For Britain, the 18th century brought both expansion and crisis, victory and humiliation, dominance and loss. It was during this period that the empire reached for the New World, with one hand and held India with the other, believing itself strong enough to grasp both. But empires stretch, and when they stretch too far, something begins to crack. In North America, the British colonies had grown steadily from fragile settlements into thriving communities. Cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston bustled with trade. Farmlands spread into native territories. The people, though nominally British subjects, began to see themselves as something more complex. Not quite English anymore, but not entirely American either. They were free enough to speak out, but bound by a distant king. They were wealthy enough to trade, but taxed by a parliament they could not vote in. And beneath the surface of loyalty, a quiet storm was gathering. That storm was fed by war. The 7 Years' War, a global conflict between Britain and France, had ended in victory for the British Empire. But at great cost. The war had expanded Britain's territories, especially in Canada and India, but it had also emptied the treasury. To recover financially, Parliament looked toward its colonies in America and asked them to contribute. New taxes were levied. On tea, on paper, on everyday goods. These were not crushing in themselves, but they ignited a deeper resentment, sense that the colonies were being treated not as partners in empire, but as profit centers to be squeezed. The protests began with pamphlets and petitions. They escalated into boycotts, riots, and symbolic acts of defiance, most famously the Boston Tea Party, where barrels of British tea were dumped into the harbor in a cold, moonlit act of protest. Britain responded not with negotiation, but with punishment, sending more troops, tightening laws, and demanding obedience. The colonies, however, had changed. They were no longer afraid. They were angry. And anger in the hands of farmers, blacksmiths, and lawyers became revolution. The American War of Independence was not just a military conflict, it was a philosophical rupture, a rebellion against monarchy, against taxation without representation, against the assumption that imperial subjects must forever remain subordinate. The British believed their military superiority would crush the rebellion quickly, but the geography, the spirit of resistance, and the intervention of France turned the tide. After years of fighting, humiliation, and attrition, Britain surrendered at Yorktown in 1781, and with that, the 13 colonies were gone, not just lost, but reborn into something else, the United States of America. For Britain, the loss was devastating. An entire continent, cultivated, settled, and fought over for more than a century, had broken free. It was the largest defeat in the history of the empire. But in the shadows of that defeat, something strange happened. The empire adapted. It did not crumble. Shifted. The loss of America forced Britain to look elsewhere, to double down on India, to expand in Africa, to explore the Pacific. Australia was colonized soon after. Settled initially as a penal colony, but destined to become another outpost of imperial order. Naval power continued to grow. Trade routes were fortified. And within the halls of government, a new lesson was absorbed, that empires must be managed not just with muskets, but with systems. The American experience taught Britain that colonies with British settlers would eventually demand rights, and possibly independence. So in future ventures, it often chose a different strategy. Dominate places where direct representation could be delayed, suppressed, or denied. India became the jewel. Africa became the next frontier. The empire, no longer purely mercantile, became administrative, institutional, and more deeply embedded in the lives of its subjects. The redcoat, once a symbol of strength, became a memory of what could be lost if the balance of power slipped. And so the empire learned to wear different uniforms. Sometimes it came as a teacher, sometimes as a banker, sometimes as a missionary or a judge. But beneath the surface, the same machinery of control remained. Only now it moved more carefully, more strategically. In the decades that followed, the British Empire would grow even larger, far larger than it had been with America in its grasp. But something had changed. The dream of empire had become more guarded. The illusion of permanence had been broken. And the lesson learned across the fields of Lexington and the forests of Virginia would echo in future rebellions. From Ireland to India to Kenya, wherever people under the British crown began to imagine a different life, one not defined by foreign rule. The British had lost their colonies, but not their empire. And in some strange way, it was through that loss that they discovered how to build one even more enduring. Not by standing still, but by adapting. Not by clinging to the past, but by reinventing the future of control. By the middle of the 19th century, the British Empire stood astride the globe with a confidence so absolute it seemed almost divine. The sun, as the saying went, never set on its dominions, and the phrase was not just poetic. British colonies, protectorates, dominions, and territories spread across every continent, touching every ocean, governing every time zone, from the plains of India to the ports of Singapore, from the gold fields of South Africa to the sheep stations of New Zealand, from the icy corners of Canada to the Caribbean islands that once bled sugar. Britain ruled not just over land and resources, but over people, laws, languages, and lives. This era of dominance came to be known as Pax Britannica, the British peace, period roughly spanning from 1815, following the defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo, to the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. During this time, the British Royal Navy was unrivaled on the seas. British industry dominated global trade. British banks financed the development of infrastructure across continents. British ideals of governance, or at least the British version of them, were exported to distant colonies. It was a time of relative global stability, at least for the great powers. Britain stood at the center of it all, cloaked in prestige, wealth, and a deep belief in its own civilizing mission. But beneath the calm surface, the peace was never as universal as it appeared. It was peace for some, but not for all. It was peace purchased through conquest, maintained through surveillance, and enforced by the constant threat of imperial power. It was a peace that often required violence to sustain. Rebellions crushed, famines mismanaged, cultures erased, and entire populations restructured to serve the needs of the empire. The illusion of harmony rested on a complex architecture of control. At the center of this structure was London, its government buildings humming with activity, its docks filled with ships carrying tea, rubber, coal, cotton, opium, and gold. British administrators dressed in linen suits or wool coats departed from Southampton or Liverpool to take up posts in Lagos, Calcutta, or Hong Kong. Some went out as governors, others as missionaries or engineers. Many believed, sincerely or cynically, that they were spreading civilization. They brought railways and legal codes, but also hierarchy, segregation, extractive policies that often served the empire's economy more than the local population. Technology was used as a tool of expansion. Telegraph shrank distance. Steamships cut weeks into days. Railroads were laid across India, Africa, and Australia, not for the benefit of the colonized, but to move goods, soldiers, and administrators more efficiently. These were arteries of empire, pumping British control deeper into local societies, linking capital cities not just in trade, but in surveillance and command. Language became an empire in itself. English was taught in schools, used in courts, and printed in newspapers. It was positioned as a gateway to modernity. But it also erased native tongues and reshaped how people thought, argued, and even prayed. Cultural imperialism often did more than borders or battles to reshape the world. It was invisible, slow, and lasting. Economically, Britain grew fat on global trade. Industrial revolution had turned the country into a factory for the world. Raw materials flowed in from colonies, rubber from Malaya, cotton from India, diamonds from South Africa, and finished goods flowed out again, sold back to the very regions from which the materials had been taken. Colonial economies were often restructured to support this rhythm. Locals were encouraged or forced to grow cash crops instead of food. Markets were opened not freely, but under duress, with gunboats often nearby to ensure compliance. But Pax Britannica also depended on myth, the myth of British superiority, of cultural destiny, of benevolent rule. This myth was reinforced in schools, in churches, in parliament, and in newspapers. It painted empire as a gift, not a theft. It told Britons they were chosen to lead, told colonized peoples they were lucky to be governed. And when rebellion came, as it often did, it was framed as irrational, savage, or misguided, rather than as the natural response of the oppressed. There were revolts and resistances in nearly every corner of the empire. In India, the 1857 rebellion had already shown that even company rule had limits. In Jamaica, the Morant Bay Uprising in 1865 was crushed with brutal efficiency. In Africa, resistance to British rule flared across the Zulu Kingdom, Nigeria, and Kenya. In Ireland, resentment brewed quietly, sometimes violently, just across the Irish Sea, and in every instance, the empire responded with a mixture of legal suppression, military force, and the reassertion of its moral right to govern. And yet, for many in Britain, this was an age of pride, an era when schoolchildren traced maps covered in red and learned to believe that their small island had tamed the world. Queen Victoria, reigning over it all, became more than a monarch. She was an icon of imperial virtue, named Empress of India in 1876. Her image printed on coins, stamps, and portraits from Lagos to Lahore. The empire became personal, something to be proud of, to fight for, to defend at all costs. But empires built on imbalance always carry the seeds of their own undoing. Beneath the surface of Pax Britannica was unrest. A growing awareness in the colonies that the promises of civilization were empty if not accompanied by dignity, quality, and autonomy. The peace, as serene as it seemed, was only possible so long as those being ruled remained compliant or silenced. And that silence was beginning to crack. As the 20th century approached, the world was changing. New powers were rising. New ideologies were spreading. And even as Britain stood at the height of its global influence, cracks were forming beneath the polished surface of its imperial confidence. The empire had achieved its greatest extent, but the age of unquestioned dominance was drawing to a close. By the late 19th century, the British Empire had already wrapped its red grip around distant continents. Yet there remained one vast region whose inner lands were still unmapped, its kingdoms still unconquered, and its resources still untouched by European control. That region was Africa. And what followed over the next few decades was one of the most aggressive, exploitative, and catastrophic episodes of imperial expansion the modern world had ever seen, a race not of explorers, but of empires, each scrambling to divide a continent that neither invited nor welcomed them. The scramble for Africa was not a spontaneous event. It was a calculated reconfiguration of colonial ambition. And Britain, already deeply entrenched along Africa's coasts, seized the moment to extend its power deep into the interior. With ships that cut across the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, with railways built over bones and jungles, and with treaties signed at gunpoint or through deception, the empire began to carve enormous territories into administrative units. Borders drawn with rulers, lines that split rivers, mountains, and families with equal indifference. The justification was familiar. Britain, along with its European rivals, claimed to bring civilization, commerce, and Christianity to what they called the Dark Continent. In reality, the conquest was driven by greed, strategic advantage, and the insatiable appetite for raw materials. Gold, diamonds, rubber, ivory, cocoa, coffee, and labor itself. Africa, rich in resources, was treated not as a continent of nations, languages, and cultures, but as a vast, silent vault waiting to be cracked open. At the heart of Britain's African ambitions was a figure whose name would become synonymous with imperial arrogance: Cecil Rhodes, a businessman, politician, and ideologue. Rhodes dreamed of a British Africa stretching uninterrupted from Cape to Cairo. He believed in the racial superiority of Anglo-Saxons, believed empire was not only destiny, but duty, done under his leadership. British influence expanded aggressively into southern and central Africa, through the mining operations of the De Beers Company, through railroads built to exploit rather than connect, and through the violent suppression of any native population that dared resist. In places like Zimbabwe, then named Rhodesia in his honor, and South Africa, Britain established settler colonies where European populations were given land, rights, and legal privileges, while black Africans were pushed onto reserves, denied representation, taxed without consent, and punished for imagined infractions. The very soil of Africa became a tool of division. Land was not merely taken, it was classified, fenced, and monetized. Further north in Egypt, Britain initially moved in under the pretext of protecting trade routes and stabilizing local governance. But once the Suez Canal, a critical artery linking Britain to its empire in India, came under British control, the occupation turned permanent. The Nile, like the Thames before it, became a river of empire. British officials governed not in the name of Egyptians, but in the interests of London, exporting cotton, importing British goods, and embedding colonial administration beneath a thin veneer of modernization. In Kenya, the empire created a model that would define its later colonial rule. European settlers were given access to prime farmland, while native populations were moved into reserves, taxed heavily, and forced to work on plantations or infrastructure projects. Resistance was frequent, sometimes quiet, sometimes armed. Rebellions were met with scorched earth tactics, detention camps, and collective punishments. Those who opposed empire were often labeled as savages, criminals, or extremists, their grievances buried beneath imperial reports that praised progress. Throughout the continent, missionaries arrived alongside administrators, preaching salvation while unknowingly, or sometimes knowingly, facilitating domination. Indigenous religions were suppressed. Traditional practices were outlawed. Education was reshaped in the image of empire, teaching English, history from a colonial perspective, and obedience to imperial authority. Children were taught to view their own heritage as backward, their ancestors as primitive, and their future as inevitably British. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 85, where European powers sat around a table and divided Africa among themselves with no African present, symbolized the entire era. It was a cold, bureaucratic dissection of a living continent. Britain walked away from the conference with enormous territorial claims, from Nigeria to Uganda, from Sierra Leone to the Gold Coast, and began to build the administrative machinery needed to exploit them. And yet, for all the violence and disruption, the people of Africa did not disappear. They adapted, they resisted, they remembered. Secret schools were created. Oral histories were preserved. Networks of solidarity formed across tribes, ethnic lines, and even colonial borders. It's the seeds of anti-colonial movements. Decades later, were already being planted by those who observed the hypocrisy of British rule and dared to imagine freedom. Too many Britons back home, the expansion into Africa was seen as a triumph. Maps turned red overnight. The Queen's image appeared in distant provinces. The empire seemed invincible. But for those living under its rule, the scramble for Africa was not a golden age. It was a catastrophe. A moment when empires treated humanity as geography, when borders were drawn with no regard for history, and when entire ways of life were destabilized to serve the appetite of a distant crown. Africa had become part of the empire, not by invitation, not by negotiation, but by force, bureaucracy, and ruthless efficiency. And though the sun still shone on the British flag, it now cast very long shadows across the continent. For every empire that has ever stretched its reach across the world, there comes a moment when the applause begins to fade, the banners begin to sag, and the structure, once seemingly eternal, starts to creak beneath the weight of its own contradictions. For the British Empire, this moment did not come all at once, and it did not arrive with a dramatic collapse. It came slowly, in scattered voices, in restless villages, in courtrooms, in underground presses, in whispered conversations and shouted slogans. The voices of the colonized beginning to turn the mirror back toward the colonizer. By the beginning of the 20th century, the cracks in the crown were already visible, even if few in London were ready to admit it. Across the empire, people had begun to question the very premise of British rule, not only because of the violence it had inflicted, but because of the promises it failed to keep. The rhetoric of civilization, law, and liberty sounded increasingly hollow in places where freedoms were denied. Rights were withheld, and traditions were erased. In India, the jewel in the imperial crown, frustration had begun to boil into organized dissent. The British Raj, which had replaced the East India Company after the rebellion of 1857, governed with a heavy and often callous hand. Railways and courts were built, but so were legal systems that excluded Indians from real power. English education was promoted, but its graduates were often barred from meaningful roles. A new class of Indian intellectuals, lawyers, journalists, and reformers began to emerge. Men and women who spoke English fluently, knew British law intimately, and used the tools of empire to expose its hypocrisies. Figures like Dadabhai, Nauroji, Gopal Krishna, Gokhale, and later Mohandas Gandhi became voices not of rebellion in the old military sense, but of a moral and political awakening. They argued that India deserved not just better treatment, but self-determination. The Indian National Congress, founded in 1885, began as a platform for debate and reform. Over time, it would evolve into the spearhead of a national movement for independence, one that would challenge the British not only with protests and marches, but with philosophy, strategy, and relentless pressure. Meanwhile, in Ireland, the empire faced rebellion from within its own backyard. Long ruled as a colony. In all but name, Ireland remained a wound in the side of Britain, a land with its own language, faith and identity, yet governed by distant officials in Westminster. Irish calls for home rule were repeatedly delayed, ignored, or undermined. In 1916, during the chaos of the First World War, Irish Republicans launched the Easter Rising in Dublin, a short-lived but symbolic rebellion that would set in motion years of struggle, culminating in the partition of Ireland and the eventual formation of the Irish Free State in Africa. 2. Opposition grew steadily. In Nigeria, Ghana, and Kenya, resistance took many forms: labor strikes, press campaigns, and eventually organized political movements. In South Africa, the racial hierarchies established under British rule would harden into apartheid, but not without decades of protest from those who saw clearly the lie beneath imperial claims of fairness. The British Empire had always divided its subjects by race, class, language, but it now found itself increasingly unable to contain their unity against it. Even in the far reaches of the empire, in the Caribbean, in Malaya, in Burma, in Palestine, demands for change began to rise. Some of these were movements for reform, others sought full independence. All shared a growing realization that British rule, for all its infrastructure and institutions, was built upon inequality, and that the time for silent endurance had passed. Back in Britain, the mood was changing too. Slowly, unevenly, and not without resistance. Some parliamentarians and reformers began to speak openly about the need for decolonization. Others clung to imperial nostalgia, unable or unwilling to imagine a world where Britain was no longer at the center. The empire had become part of the national psyche. Taught in schools, celebrated in ceremonies, embedded in the stories Britain told itself about who it was. But the stories were being challenged. New narratives were being written by those who had lived under imperial rule and now sought to write their own futures. The world was changing. The idea of empire, once so solid, so unquestioned, was beginning to appear brittle, outdated, and unsustainable. And yet, the British government continued to assert control, to manage dissent, and to offer reforms that often fell short of true autonomy. Small concessions were made in some colonies. Local councils, limited suffrage, symbolic appointments. But these gestures only revealed how little real power had changed hands. The empire, increasingly strained, relied more and more on bureaucracy, propaganda, and divide-and-rule strategies to maintain control. The cracks were no longer isolated. They were everywhere. Widening in silence and in fire, the empire was entering a new phase, one in which resistance would become more organized, more global, and more determined. The days of unchallenged rule were over. The crown remained on the map. The flag still flew in the colonies. But beneath the surface, the architecture of empire was beginning to tremble. The rebellion had already begun, not always with rifles, but with ideas. And ideas once planted are harder to defeat than armies. For centuries, the British Empire had endured storms and rebellions, navigated financial crashes and regional collapses, and yet it always seemed to find its footing again. Always managed to reassert itself, to redraw its borders, to rename its losses as transitions. But with the arrival of the 20th century's Great Wars, first in 1914, and then again in 1939, the illusion of imperial invincibility began to crack. Not just in the farthest colonies, but in the heart of the empire itself. These were not colonial wars fought in distant jungles or deserts. These were global cataclysms that shook the foundation of everything Britain had built. And in their wake, the empire that had once ruled a quarter of the world's population would begin to slide.
Slowly.
And then rapidly, toward dissolution. The First World War, brutal and mechanized, was not just a European tragedy. It was a war of empire. Men were drawn from every corner of Britain's dominions. Indian soldiers fought in the trenches of France. African laborers carried supplies through desert campaigns. Canadians stormed Vimy Ridge. Australians and New Zealanders bled at Gallipoli. The war demanded not just loyalty, but bodies, and the colonies delivered. In return, many colonial subjects believed they had earned something greater than medals or monuments. They believed they had earned the right to be heard, to be treated as equals, or at the very least, as partners in the world they had helped defend. But the promises made during war, promises of reform, self-rule, gradual independence, were often delayed or denied. The post-war settlement focused not on decolonization, but on redistribution. New territories were acquired under the League of Nations. Mandates from Palestine to Mesopotamia, and Britain expanded even further. Even as the strain of governance grew, empire was winning territory while losing legitimacy. And while London congratulated itself on its victories, resentment fermented beneath the surface. The interwar period brought new pressures. Economic depression shook the global system. Nationalist movements, inspired by the rhetoric of self-determination, gained ground. In India, Gandhi's movement of nonviolent resistance grew from protest to nationwide campaign, challenging not only British laws, but the very morality of imperial rule. In Egypt, Iraq, and Kenya, similar stirrings emerged, movements that combined local grievances with broader ideals of sovereignty and identity. Then came World War II, a conflict even more total, more destructive, more revealing. Once again, Britain called upon its empire to fight, and once again it answered. Over 2 million Indian soldiers served in the British forces, the largest volunteer army in history. African troops fought in jungles and deserts. Caribbean pilots flew in the Royal Air Force. The empire stood with Britain, but at a cost. And this time, the cost would not be buried in silence. The war weakened Britain in ways that could no longer be hidden. Cities were bombed, economies were drained. The military was stretched thin. Rationing continued for years. And perhaps most significantly, the myth of empire was no longer convincing, even to those who had once upheld it. The United States had emerged as a superpower, a republic with anti-colonial roots and its own global ambitions. The Soviet Union promoted a competing ideology that denounced imperialism as capitalist tyranny. And within the colonies, returning soldiers who had fought fascism abroad began to ask why they were expected to accept oppression at home. In India, the movement for independence had become unstoppable. The Quit India movement, launched during the war, had already shaken British authority. Gandhi's repeated imprisonments had only deepened the cause's symbolic power. The crown jewel was granted independence, a hurried, blood-stained, and chaotic departure that led to the partition of the subcontinent. The creation of Pakistan, and a wave of communal violence that killed hundreds of thousands. India's independence was not just symbolic, it was a rupture. It proved that the empire could and would unravel. The dominoes began to fall. Burma in 1948. Ceylon and Ghana shortly after. In Palestine, Britain withdrew amid growing violence, ceding the stage to a new regional conflict. In Kenya, resistance took the form of the MOL uprising, a brutal guerrilla war that was answered by Britain with mass internments, executions, and torture. A final, desperate attempt to preserve an empire already slipping away. At home, the British public, weary from war rationing and economic stagnation, no longer had the appetite to police a globe. The Suez Crisis of 1956, in which Britain attempted to reassert control over the Suez Canal alongside France and Israel, ended in diplomatic humiliation when the United States refused to support the venture. Throughout the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the empire became a shadow of itself, its territories dissolving into a commonwealth that preserved ceremonial links, but not sovereignty. The Union Jack was lowered again and again, in Malaya, in Nigeria, in Trinidad, in Jamaica, in Uganda, in Hong Kong. Each time a symbol not only of independence gained, but of an old world disappearing. And yet, even in its final stages, the British Empire never admitted defeat. It reframed its losses as transformations. It told itself that decolonization was not collapse but evolution, that it had granted independence, not been forced to retreat, that it had left behind schools, laws, railways, and language. A legacy of civilization rather than exploitation. But the people who had lived under its rule told a different story. A story of silence, of struggle, of resistance and erasure, of cultures rewritten and histories distorted. The war had done what no rebellion could. It had exhausted the empire from within. And as the Union Jack came down in capital after capital, the truth became clear. The British Empire had not fallen in one final blow. It had been quietly unraveling all along. Empires do not vanish when their flags are lowered or their borders are redrawn. They do not simply end, they echo. And the British Empire, more than any in modern history, has proven how deeply the structures of power, the habits of dominance, and the patterns of inequality can survive long after the empire itself is gone. In the decades following decolonization, the British Empire did not disappear. It transformed into myth, into memory, into migration and media, into a ghost that still walks quietly through the streets of London, whispers in schoolbooks, and lingers in laws, languages, and identities. In the official narrative, the empire ended with grace. The story told in textbooks and speeches was one of benevolent transition, of colonies given independence, of peaceful handovers, of flags exchanged for handshakes. But for those who lived through the withdrawals, the legacy felt far less polite. In many places, Britain left behind civil wars, partition lines, broken economies, and fragile states, places like Sudan, Palestine, Kashmir, and Cyprus, where imperial management had masked deep divisions that erupted once Britain stepped back. The exits were often rushed, the borders hastily drawn, the consequences long-lasting. Yet as formal empire receded, a quieter phenomenon took its place. Migration. From the Caribbean, from South Asia, from Africa, and beyond, thousands of former colonial subjects began to arrive in Britain. Answering calls for labor in the post-war economy, they came on ships like the Empire Windrush. They came in search of opportunity. They came because they were told they belonged, that the empire was a family, and they were part of it. But what they found was often contradiction. They were welcomed in theory and rejected in practice. They were given work, but denied housing. They were part of the Commonwealth, but treated as outsiders. The empire had once ruled their lands. Now they walked the streets of the imperial capital, delivering letters, driving buses, nursing the sick, and yet they were often made to feel invisible. The empire, it turned out, had not prepared Britain to be a multicultural society. It had prepared it to rule others, not to live alongside them. These communities, Indian, Pakistani, Jamaican, Nigerian, Bangladeshi, Somali began to shape Britain in ways that were profound and irreversible. Languages, traditions, they opened shops, founded newspapers, built mosques and temples, created new cultural identities that fused the colonial past with the urban present. Over time, they would raise new generations, British-born, empire-shaped, who would demand recognition, rights, and dignity. But the legacy of empire lingered in policy and perception. Immigration laws became more restrictive. Debates about identity grew sharper. The rise of far-right movements, tensions in urban neighborhoods, and a political rhetoric that often framed migration as a problem. Rather than a history, all of it spoke to a country struggling to reconcile its imperial past with its post-colonial present. Meanwhile, the empire continued to exist in memory, curated in museums, dramatized in films, romanticized in literature. The statues of imperial figures remained in public squares. Streets still bore the names of colonial generals. Institutions founded with imperial wealth still shaped the British elite. And in many schools, the story of the empire was told not as a tale of conquest and resistance, but as one of progress, of railways built, of governments modernized, of law and language gifted to the world. But history does not forget so easily. In India, the scars of partition remain open. In Kenya, survivors of British detention camps still live with the trauma. In the Caribbean, descendants of enslaved Africans call for reparations, not rhetoric. In Ireland, the wounds of empire shape politics to this day. Past is not past. It is inherited. The Commonwealth, that peculiar institution of former colonies and dominions, remains a symbolic echo, a place where heads of state gather, where flags are waved, where tradition continues. But it is not a substitute for empire. It is a reminder of what was, and, for some, what was taken. In the 21st century, Britain continues to grapple with its imperial shadow. The Brexit debate, filled with language of sovereignty, control, and global reach, revealed how deep the empire's memory still runs in national identity. If for some, the empire is a source of shame. For others, nostalgia. For most, it is both. A burden and a myth, a legacy and a distortion. And so the British Empire lives on, not as a political reality, but as a cultural force, a historical question. A ghost that drifts through parliaments and playgrounds, through archives and ancestry tests. Its languages are spoken across continents. Its borders still shape international disputes. Its institutions, from law to banking to education, still carry traces of imperial design. Empires fall, but they don't vanish. They leave imprints on land, on people, on memory. The British Empire once ruled from a small island in the North Atlantic. Once enforced by gunboats and governors, once justified by hymns and history books, is gone. But its shadow remains. And in that shadow, a new reckoning has begun. One that asks not only what the empire did, but what it left behind in all of us. Empires are never only about maps or conquests. They are about afterlives, the structures, systems, and scars that remain long after the flags are lowered and the last garrison is withdrawn. And perhaps no empire in modern history has cast a longer, more complex shadow than the British Empire, whose rise from a rainy island to global dominance reshaped not just the politics of the world, but its cultures, economies, and imaginations. To understand what the British Empire left behind is not merely to list what it built or broke, it is to trace the DNA of our modern world, to see where its fingerprints remain, quietly shaping the rules by which billions still live. It begins with language. Today, English is spoken by over 1.5 billion people. As a native tongue, as a second language, as a bridge between continents, it is the language of international business, diplomacy, science, and the internet. But it did not spread by accident. It spread through conquest, through classrooms where native languages were shamed, or courts where justice was spoken only in English. Through churches that translated Bibles and hymns into the imperial voice. It spread through policy, through pressure, through force. And yet now, it connects the children of colonizers and colonized alike. A shared vocabulary born of unequal pasts. It continues with law and government. Many countries across Asia, Africa, the Caribbean still operate under legal systems rooted in British common law, systems designed to serve colonial administrators, now repurposed for independent states. Parliaments with Westminster structures, civil service hierarchies, and bureaucratic norms all echo the empire's rulebook. For some, these institutions have brought stability. For others, they have imposed models that never fit local realities. Foreign shapes forced onto indigenous frameworks. Then there's education. Across the former empire, generations were taught British history before their own. Shakespeare before their native literature, Newton before native science. The goal was never just literacy, it was loyalty. Empire did not merely occupy land, it occupied minds. It taught colonial subjects to look toward Britain as the center of knowledge, of reason, of order. And while post-independence curricula have changed, the legacy remains. In syllabi, in exams, in the hierarchy of whose knowledge matters most. Economically, the empire left a patchwork of inequality. Railways, ports, and telegraphs were built, but often to extract resources, not develop local economies. Industries were structured to serve British markets. Cash crops replaced subsistence farming. Colonial wealth enriched British banks, not colonial communities. Even today, the global economic order still reflects those patterns, where raw materials flow from poorer countries to richer ones, where trade agreements favor the former imperial core, where wealth remains unevenly inherited. But beyond systems and structures, the British Empire left behind something more intangible, a worldview, a way of seeing, classifying, and ranking people. It sorted humanity into races, castes, and categories, often pseudoscientific, always hierarchical. These ideas were written into census forms, marriage laws, school admissions, and passports. They did not vanish with decolonization. They survived in prejudice, in policing, in politics. In assumptions about who belongs and who doesn't, the empire racialized the world, and the world is still unlearning it. And yet, in its aftermath, there is also something else: resilience. The story of empire is not just what Britain did to others, it is also what others did in response. Resistance movements across continents laid the groundwork for modern democracies, civil rights campaigns, and cultural revivals. Writers from India, Nigeria, Jamaica, Pakistan, South Africa, and beyond have taken the language of empire and turned it into poetry, protest, and power. Music, food, fashion, and film in former colonies have fused British influence with local traditions to create entirely new global cultures. Even Britain itself has been transformed. The streets of London now speak with the voices of its former empire. Bengali, Yoruba, Punjabi, Patois. British identity is no longer only white or Anglo-Saxon. It is post-colonial. It is multicultural. It is, whether it admits it or not, the product of centuries of entanglement with the world it once ruled. The legacy of the British Empire is not a single thing. It is contradiction. It is railways and repression. It is law and looting. It is Shakespeare and stolen artifacts. It is the English language and the silence of erased histories. It is pride and pain, nostalgia and mourning, progress and trauma, woven together in ways that make clean endings impossible. For some, the empire is a source of national greatness. For others, it is the root of generational injustice. Both are true, because empires do not simply die. They echo, distort, and persist. They live on in the names of cities, in the borders of nations, in the debt of former colonies, in the museums of Europe, in the migration patterns of people still searching for opportunities denied at home. To ask what the British Empire left the world is to ask what world we now live in. One shaped by the movements of ships and armies, of ideas and resistance, of power and its unraveling. The empire is gone. The aftermath is still unfolding. And the final chapter is not written by historians, but by all of us. As we continue to live in the world it left behind,